So my name's John Alexander. I run an organisation called the NewCitizenship project, and what we are essentially is an innovation company, and we're different because we think of people differently. Instead of thinking of people as consumers, which creates a world where really you can only come up with a certain kind of idea, and it's ideas that people can buy from you, we think of people as citizens. We think of them as active participants who can buy into what the ideas we create and help participate in shaping them and delivering them with us. The way we think the world works, we tend to think that we occupy a lot of different roles in society at different times, that we're consumers and citizens and parents and shareholders and employers and employees at all at different times, and we step between them. And what I'm talking about when I talk about the citizen and the consumer is actually something that I believe what happens is that something always in society steps up above those immediate roles, and there's a kind of meta role that starts to infuse all of those different things with its logic. And when I'm talking about the citizen, I think we've been on a journey over the last century or so where that idea has been shifting and changing. So we talk about an idea of the evolution of the role of the individual in society. So very broad brushstrokes, but sort of pre-World War II, the dominant idea of the individual, in my mind, is something like the subject. Is sort of, and the idea there is sort of get what you're given, keep your head down, do as you're told, you know, and you'll be looked after. If you do your bit, don't ask too many questions, you'll be all right. And out of the Second World War through the 50s and 60s, and coming to a pinnacle in the 80s, this idea of the consumer emerges and kind of takes hold. And the interesting thing about that is when you tell that story in that perspective, you see the consumer actually originally as a very positive, liberating shift. So with the consumer, the idea of the consumer is something like get the best deal for yourself, look out for number one, and actually if everyone does that, then the best things for society as a whole will emerge. So it is it is a moral idea, and with it versus the subject, it brings freedom of choice, the right to complain, competition for standards, accountability in government services and so forth, and some really positive things. And I love the story that in 1960 Hotpoint released a washing machine called the Liberator. So you sort of get the sense of it. And I think you look at the year 1984 and the original Band-Aid. You look at the launch of brands like Apple into the computer market. There was previously only one brand, Virgin Atlantic. All of these things, kind of in the 80s, embodying a different promise. But the problem then is that where we are now, I think that idea of the consumer is starting to run out of road. And we're seeing the problems of it coming into all of these different sort of sub-roles that we play. So as parents, arguably, we've become consumers to a dangerous degree. So the UK came bottom of a UNICEF study on childhood well-being across all OECD nations a few years back. And the follow-up study found that high childhood materialism was a primary driver of that. So we're seeing good parenting as providing stuff rather than time. Shareholding as consumerism. We sort of put money into organisations and expect more money back rather than actually holding a share in the organisation. I think the opportunity of the citizen versus the consumer is an idea of people actually, of the right thing to do as being to take an active role in shaping the context of your own life. So not just, and of society as a whole, so not just being about get the best deal for yourself, but actually of taking moral agency, of shaping what you're part of. And one of the ways that I think we can think about this is in the ear of the subject, very much leadership and the elites in society sort of talk down to the masses. In the ear of the consumer, there was much of a flip, and it was all about sort of looking up and trying to serve the masses. And now I think we're kind of maturing into an era where actually we can stand side by side and go, what society do we want together? And I think that's the world that's emerging as the era of the citizen. Mm-hmm. So I think when it comes to government, there's something very interesting going on, which is the language makes people think that we're all okay. So because when we deal with government, the word citizen gets applied, but it's not really citizenship. And I would argue that a lot of the problems that we face come from the fact that government services and that language, that word service itself is very interesting, still tends to see people largely as subjects. So the quality of customer service isn't even there. And so for many government services, there's still a lot of positives to be gained from moving actually into an era of the consumer and starting to serve people properly. But the real opportunity and what's emerging through work like the civic enterprise work that's gone on, that's being led by Leeds City Council and others, and by organisations like Patient Opinion in the NHS, and by some work that we're involved with in the BBC and other places, is actually going, rather than try and just flip the model on its head and go, we've been ignoring your needs, and go to, we're going to serve you in whatever way we can and just deliver value for money. Actually, there's a thing of let's work together to deliver a better society, and I think it's a very different mental pattern. I think the first way that people should be acting differently in delivery of government services is actually to see and appreciate the importance of language. And I think when there's a big trend to start trying to talk about customers and consumers in government service, and I think that itself is dangerous, because when you think of people as consumers and customers, there's only really one interaction they can have with you, which is to buy from you. If you think of people as citizens and you start using that language internally and really using it and thinking about what it means, and using language like participants, then and thinking about working with people rather than delivering a service to people or for people, then you start coming up with very different ideas and ways of doing things, and you start to think, well, how could we develop this service, and then the actions follow from the thought pattern. So if you're thinking of people as citizens that you want to work with instead of consumers that you want to sell to or provide for, then you start to think, well, you start to think differently about how you develop services. So you go, if we're working with people, then we should involve them in designing and developing the service. And then from there, and what comes out of that process will always be something very different. And one of the ways that we like to talk about is and one example to make this maybe a bit more tangible is, if you think about the BBC, I would argue that the BBC was created to some extent in the era of the subject to inform, educate and entertain the subjects, and is now really trying to get into the era of the consumer and create content that's value for money for consumers. But really the opportunity is something different. The opportunity is to come into the citizen era and think about how can a public service broadcaster or public service media company work with the citizens to create culture and curate culture and define the culture that we have together, rather than define it for people and create stuff for people.